Okay, let's unpack this. We're going deep today into a truly mind-bending idea. What does it mean when the architecture of your subconscious matches someone else's? Not just, metaphorically, but specifically. We are talking about millions of people reporting they've dreamt of the exact same visually identical kind of haunting, recurring locations.
It really is. It's an idea that sort of flips the concept of private thought completely on its head. And this deep dive, it's rooted entirely in a dense and fascinating psychological exploration. The title is Shared Dreamscapes and the Collective Unconscious.
Right. That title alone tells you we're heading into some pretty deep philosophical waters here. So our mission today is basically to give you the shortcut, the cheat sheet, to understanding the core theory in this source material. The central argument seems to be that these common dream locations, they aren't just random architectural glitches in our sleep. They're meant to be intensely symbolic. And they might just tell us something really profound about the fundamental architecture of human consciousness itself.
Exactly. We're trying to examine why these specific images recur with such, shocking fidelity across so many people. The goal is to move beyond just looking at individual dream interpretation and consider what these shared structures might suggest about our, universal operating system as a species.
Which brings us straight to the phenomenon itself. Because when we talk about shared dreamscapes, we aren't just talking generally like dreaming you're falling or losing your teeth, the common stuff.
No, not at all.
We're talking about highly specific, recurring locations that people describe across different cultures, different languages, with just unbelievable consistency.
And that consistency is really the anchor for the whole study, the whole idea. Look, if 100 people describe dreaming of a red house on a hill, well, okay, that could maybe be coincidence, maybe. But when you have thousands describing the precise lighting, the specific kind of decay, and the shared emotional tension of a place that doesn't actually exist in the waking world.
Then you have to ask what's going on.
You have to ask what mechanism could possibly be at play there.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. The sheer specificity. You mentioned it, but the source material really details these shared scenes. It outlines, 4 key architectural types that just keep dominating these reports.
That's right. We see this quartet pretty consistently. The strange hallways, the endless hotels, the forgotten schools, and these vast non-existent cities. And crucially, like you said, the descriptions aren't generic. They're really detailed.
Okay, let's start with the strange hallways. What are people reporting there?
Well, they're often described as perpetually damp, sometimes extending horizontally almost infinitely, usually without windows. And the lighting is specific, too often flickering, kind of jaundiced fluorescent tubes.
And the feeling.
The feeling is key. You're almost never running down them in a panic. It's more like you're always walking slowly, sensing something just around the next bend, something you can't quite place, a sense of anticipation, maybe dread.
Okay, unsettling. Then you have the endless hotels. Sounds slightly better, maybe.
You'd think, but no. This isn't some nice resort you're dreaming about. This hotel nearly always features a unique and specific type of, let's call it failure. Things like a strange lobby clock that runs backward.
Okay, that's odd.
Right. And the carpet, this detail comes up constantly, mentioned independently by thousands of dreamers. It's universally described as a sickly, thick, orange shag carpet.
Wow, orange shag. That's specific.
That's specific. And the experience within the hotel dream is usually one of 2 things. You're either perpetually looking for your room, wandering endless corridors, or you're desperately trying to check out, but you just cannot find the main entrance. That feeling of being trapped.
That detail about the orange shag carpet, that's the kind of surprising specificity that really grabs you, isn't it? It feels too random, too peculiar to just be coincidence.
It does. It challenges simple explanations.
And then the forgotten schools.
These are often described as massive, imposing buildings, often built of gray stone, and they have this overwhelmingly specific feeling of institutional decay, neglect.
And the scenario?
Almost always, you're late for a test you completely forgot to study for. And you're navigating these labyrinthine, locker-lined halls, trying to find the right room, feeling that panic rise.
Yeah, that sounds familiar, unfortunately.
Taps into a very common anxiety. And the source material really emphasizes that the shared experience is never mundane. It's about the shared emotional mapping. You don't feel comfortable or relaxed in the endless hotel. You feel perpetually transient or isolated or stuck. You don't feel nostalgic or happy in the forgotten school. You feel judged, tested, or just profoundly unprepared for something that feels imminent.
Okay, So if these incredibly specific locations, down to the carpet color, the backward clock, are showing up in millions of different minds independently, we've got two main competing theories within this psychological exploration trying to explain the why. Let's start with theory one. This is the one that tries to keep the interpretation of the dream firmly rooted within universal but still individual psychology, subconscious emotional mapping.
Right. This is the more, let's say, grounded, functional interpretation presented in the source. And what's fascinating here is the idea that the brain isn't using these common architectural forms as symbols of things necessarily, but as symbolic reflections of shared psychological processes.
Okay, so the recurring location isn't a literal place we've all somehow seen, or even an exact memory fragment. It's more like a container, a filing cabinet.
Exactly. A container is a good way to put it. The idea is the subconscious needs a kind of shorthand, a filing system, to process complex, universal emotional memories or states.
So the brain is being efficient.
Highly efficient. Think about trying to process something abstract, like the universal fear of a major life transition or the anxiety around making a difficult decision or feeling judged. Instead of just dealing with that feeling as this, abstract wave of dread or pressure, the subconscious maps it onto a concrete, shared structural symbol, like that poorly lit, never-ending hallway we talked about.
Ah, okay, so the hallway becomes the symbol for the journey, or maybe avoidance.
Precisely. The structures themselves act as these high-efficiency representations of universal emotional states or common psychological challenges, things that all humans face simply by existing.
So the forgotten school isn't necessarily about your actual school days or education per se.
Probably not directly.
It might represent those near universal anxieties about evaluation, about performance, or that feeling of being perpetually unprepared for whatever life is about to throw at you next. Life's next big test.
Yes, exactly. It's about psychological efficiency. If you just imagine that all, 8 billion humans share these core challenges: grief, loss, striving for security, the need for belonging, fear of judgment, it actually makes a kind of logical sense that the mind would either create or perhaps borrow these archetypal settings to house those common processes. The hallway symbolizes the journey or the avoidance. The endless hotel, perhaps the lack of permanence or profound inability to find true belonging or rest.
Okay, wait a second though. If the forgotten school simply maps performance anxiety, how do the proponents of theory one, the mapping theory, account for the sheer specificity? We keep coming back to this. The shared physical layout, the gray stone, the specific kind of decay, those locker-lined halls. Why that and not just, say, a generic office building or an airport terminal if it's just about anxiety?
That's a great question, and it's definitely the critical sticking point for theory one. The response from its proponents, as detailed in the source, tends to be that these specific architectural archetypes are simply the most resonant, the most potent symbols of institutional pressure or that particular kind of anxiety. And these symbols might be passed down, maybe genetically, maybe culturally, over generations.
So the school setting just works better.
It captures that specific feeling of forced conformity, external judgment, and looming tests, arguably better than, say, an airport terminal, which might usually symbolize choice, freedom, movement, something different. The argument is that the brain is basically utilizing the structural logic, the symbolic architecture that has proven most effective across generations for filing that specific type of stress response. It's optimized.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of psychological sense, an inherited, optimized dream dictionary almost. But, as you hinted, the source material and our whole reason for this deep dive doesn't just stop there. It transitions into a far more expansive and frankly more provocative theory. One that suggests something perhaps beyond individual inheritance, even if that inheritance is universal.
Yes, we shift to gears now, and the air definitely thins out a bit, metaphorically speaking. We move to theory two, the collective mind space. This is where things really transition from clever psychological interpretation to the potentially profound, or maybe just weird, depending on your perspective.
All right, before we jump into what sounds suspiciously like a shared server model for the human brain, we probably need to clarify what the source material actually means by a collective mind space. Is it just another term for Jung's idea?
It definitely builds heavily on that foundational Jungian concept of the collective unconscious, yes. That idea of a deep stratum of inherited universal symbols, myths, archetypes that exist independent of our personal experience. But theory two, as presented, seems to go a significant step further. It asserts that this isn't just a shared symbolic library that we all happen to draw from individually.
Okay.
It suggests it's an actual domain, a space that consciousness accesses, particularly during states like dreaming.
Oh, okay, so just to be clear, it's not just that we all happen to dream about similar creepy hallways, because we all share the same basic human anxieties, and our brains use similar symbolic logic.
That's theory one.
Right. Theory two is saying we might be, physically accessing a singular unified psychological place when we sleep, like logging into the same server.
That's the implication, precisely. The source material is quite clear in its assertion here. It argues that the sheer specificity and the consistency of this phenomenon, again, the orange carpet, the backward clock, makes individual psychological mapping, theory one, feel, insufficient as a complete explanation for some researchers. If the locations are this specific, this consistent across millions, it suggests we might all be guests or maybe residents in a kind of unified psychological landscape.
So the dreams themselves are like the interface. The visuals we download when our individual firewall, our ego, is down during sleep, or the endless hotel, or the non-existent city. It's just part of the foundational architecture of that collective domain, like a piece of shared virtual real estate.
That's a pretty good analogy for how theory two frames it, yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the implications. This raises a truly profound question. Are we simply sharing symbols that represent universal emotional challenges, as theory one suggests, which is fascinating enough? Or are we actually accessing a singular collective domain that actively holds these symbolic locations within its structure?
The difference really boils down to whether the commonality originates inside our individual skulls through inherited, optimized symbolic programming.
Right, the mapping model.
Or whether it originates outside our individual consciousness through shared access to some kind of collective resource.
The accessing model, exactly. And the collective mind space theory, theory two, it really challenges our most basic assumptions about the boundaries of the self, doesn't it? If this were actually true, if theory two could ever be proven, which is a huge if, the source suggests, we might even see things like shared linguistic symbols or new cultural motifs appear first in these shared dreamscapes.
Before they show up in the waking world.
Potentially, acting as subconscious precursors, maybe even drivers, of upcoming cultural shifts or emerging collective ideas.
That's a testable hypothesis, isn't it? Albeit an incredibly difficult one to test empirically. But hang on, if this is a shared mind space we're accessing, why is the architecture seemingly so universally depressing or anxious? Why an endless hotel and not, a collective peaceful meadow or a beautiful shared library?
That's a fair question. The interpretation offered within this framework is that the collective mind space, if it exists, isn't necessarily a utopia. It's more likely a reflection of the collective psyche. And the collective psyche perhaps is primarily concerned with unresolved issues, with tension, transition, and the big, difficult questions of existence. So the structures that define the shared space would naturally be the psychological pressure points of humanity. The anxiety of being tested or judged, like the school.
The fear of isolation or being stuck at the hotel.
And the challenge of the ongoing journey, the hallways. They are perhaps locations of collective processing, not collective relaxation.
Okay. Wow, that's a lot to chew on. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Try to make sense of this quite challenging information. I guess the first takeaway is it means your dreams might be less private, less uniquely yours than you think, regardless of which theory ultimately feels more plausible to you.
Absolutely. This deep dive, drawing from the source material, has really given us two primary and I think compelling arguments about the potential architecture of the human psyche, especially during sleep. We've seen theory one, shared dreamscapes, as symbolic reflections of universal emotional memory, the brain efficiently mapping common feelings onto common architectural structures, the efficient mapping model.
Or theory two. We could be looking at evidence, however strange, of a collective mind space, the accessing model. This suggests a kind of unified psychological reality that maybe all humans tap into, consciously or not, especially when our individual consciousness is undirected, like in sleep. And understanding this whole phenomenon, exploring these ideas, it really is a fascinating shortcut to thinking about not just dreams, but the potential operating limits and maybe the shared realities of the human condition itself.
And what the source material ultimately suggests, I think, is that even if the absolute truth lies strictly with theory one, even if it is just highly efficient symbolic mapping within individual brains, the psychological effect is still argued